this week, I'm going to talk about two things that may not seem to be linked: oral health and arthritis. And actually, slight confession, if you'd asked me at the start of these series of talks whether I would be giving a talk about oral health and arthritis, I might not have seen the link either, but it cropped up for me when I was just doing my due diligence and looking up the latest research on the gut microbiome and arthritis, which is much more known about as a link. And I found quite a few links to the oral microbiome and got quite interested in it and thought it warranted an additional talk. So this is sort of an area where dentistry meets the health of the rest of your body and nutrition and lifestyle medicine. And it's interesting because, you know, medicine is sort of divided up into specialities as it is, but dentists by and large are completely separate to the rest of the medical profession, where we mostly see our dentists away from hospitals, just, you know, in our local practitioner's practice. And I think that has encouraged this thinking that the health of our mouth has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of our body. Whereas, in fact, when you start looking at the research, nothing could be further from the truth. So it's quite fascinating, and I hope you'll enjoy having a little look at this today. So I'm just going to start by showing you the same diagram I showed you when we talked about the gut microbiome. And it's just really to demonstrate how the oral cavity, which obviously you can see at the top, is physically linked to the down to the stomach and the rest of the digestive system. So the oral cavity, the mouth, can be seen as the gateway to the rest of the digestive system and to the gut microbiome in the end. It's all the same tubing in the end. But the oral cavity does have its own microbiome, and that's quite distinct from the microbiome that we have in the colon. The gut microbiome. So what happens in the oral cavity? There are actually 700 different species of bacteria living in our mouth. It's mostly bacteria that have been studied, but there will be fungi and viruses in there as well, just as there are in our gut microbiome. And that makes up a population of about 2 billion bacteria. And although this is substantially smaller than the gut microbiome, the oral microbiome is nevertheless the second largest and most diverse microbiome in the human body after the gut. So we also have multiple other microbiomes. Our skin has a microbiome, our lungs have a microbiome, our urinary tract has a microbiome, you know, and these are all increasingly being studied with their relationship to health and disease. But the oral microbiome is, you know, big and significant. There's a balance in the mouth between what we can, in crude terms, label good and bad bacteria. But unlike the gut, where we can get individual species running a bit out of control and overgrowing, in the mouth, it's much less the case that we have one or two individual species causing problems. It's delicate shifts in the balance, the overall balance between the species in the mouth, that seems to make the difference between health and disease in terms of oral health. Why there's so many bacteria in the mouth in particular, I mean, they have great conditions to live there. It's warm, it's moist, and actually the constant flow of saliva in the mouth keeps bringing nutrients to bacteria. So it's a good place for them to live. And actually, teeth are the only surfaces in our body that bacteria can adhere to that don't naturally shed. So we have different areas in the mouth where bacteria can live. So we've got our cheeks, we've got around the tonsils at the back, around the tongue, you know, and most of these areas will naturally shed, as you know, skin sheds off our cheeks, etc. But the teeth do not shed, so unless we clean them, whatever bacteria are naturally there will just build up and accumulate. And as they build up and accumulate, they form, these colonies of bacteria form protective films around them, and these are called biofilms. And that sounds like a weird and fancy thing, but actually when you think of dental plaque that we're probably all quite familiar with and that your dentist is very familiar with, plaque is an oral biofilm around bacteria. And, you know, as you know, if you don't brush your teeth, that will build up and adhere to the teeth. Biofilms help to keep bacteria in contact with the teeth for longer as well. And depending on the mix of bacteria within that biofilm, that can dictate whether that encourages tooth decay or good health. So when the oral microbiome, I said it's a case of it being in balance or not. When it's out of balance, some things that we're at increased risk of will seem intuitive, like we're at increased risk of gum disease if we have an out of balance oral microbiome. The medical term for inflamed gums is gingivitis. So you might hear me talking about gingivitis. There's also another term called periodontitis or periodontal disease. The periodontal cavity is the cavity between the gum and the teeth. So you'll hear me later talking about periodontal disease. So that's like a more serious condition than gingivitis, inflamed gums. Of course, if you have an imbalance in the oral microbiome, there is an increased risk of tooth decay. And I say of course, but actually, if you speak to many dentists, not all dentists, they will say that the only factors that influence tooth decay will be whether you eat sugar or acidic foods, whether you brush properly, whether you floss, whether you use fluoride toothpaste. And I know this because I asked my son's dentist last week, is there anything else that affects the rate of formation of these biofilms? My son seems to be particularly prone to this build-up of plaques and calculus, despite his cleaning, despite good oral hygiene. And I had heard other dentists online and looking into this saying that there are other reasons behind this to do with the microbiome in the mouth, but possibly the average community dentist at the moment is not, might be being unfair, is not thinking about that at the moment, but we'll explore some of these links. So if you're holding good bacteria next to your teeth in the biofilm, you could have a buildup of plaque and maybe not have the same risk of decay if the mix of bacteria in your mouth is unhelpful, pathogenic, and held next to the teeth, more likely to have tooth decay. It does, of course, depend on your diet and those other factors as well, which we'll look at later. Now, some things that you might not think of when the oral microbiome is out of balance. There is a risk of low-grade chronic inflammation. This is the kind of inflammation that we've talked about all through these talks that keeps the immune system a bit activated so that it doesn't have, some of its resources are used up looking at that chronic inflammation. And this inflammation is local in the mouth, but also systemic. So how does what happens in the mouth influence what happens in the rest of the body? Well, you can, first of all, we talked a few weeks ago about leaky gut. You can also get sort of leaky gums, which mean that bacteria from the mouth can get into the bloodstream via gums, which may very obviously bleed if you floss or brush your teeth. So when there's a very direct route for bacteria in the mouth getting into the bloodstream. We can also swallow some of this bacteria, of course, with our saliva, and some of these bacteria can withstand the harsh environment of the stomach and get into the gut. So in the same way as our gut bacteria can influence systemic inflammation, so can bacteria in our mouth. What's all this got to do with arthritis? Well, the research is mainly to do with rheumatoid arthritis, but I suspect that other autoimmune forms of arthritis may be subject to some of the same mechanisms. So as long ago as 1918, so over 100 years ago, it was observed that in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, if you treated periodontal infections, so this is the more severe form of gum disease, that it improved. Successful treatment improved the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. And equally, if you improve the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, this seemed to improve the periodontal disease. So there's a two-way relationship between the two. Having periodontal disease doubles your risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis. And a similar relationship occurs the other way around, that if you have rheumatoid arthritis, you've got just about double the risk of developing periodontal disease, which is quite staggering, I thought, really. And interestingly, Rheumatoid arthritis is not the only disease to be influenced by periodontal disease in this way. So if you have periodontal disease, you have a 3-fold greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes. I think it's somewhere in the region. Hello? Did someone say Joan? Sorry, I thought I heard someone calling me. I think it's something like a 70% additional risk of, is it Alzheimer's? There's links to Alzheimer's anyway. There's links to cardiovascular disease. Dentists will be aware of the links with cardiovascular disease, where often they have to look at people's dental health before heart surgery because of the risk of complications there. But there's most research around periodontal disease and type 2 diabetes, but yeah, also links to plenty of other disease conditions which are really linked by systemic inflammation. So some of the same mechanisms going on influence multiple different disease conditions. In rheumatoid arthritis specifically, there's a bacteria in the mouth that's linked to gum disease called Porphyromonas gingivalis. So gingivalis, we call it, I'll just call it P. gingivalis, is easier. Gingiva to do with the gums. So a bacteria to do with the gums. And actually, people who have more severe rheumatoid arthritis have higher levels of antibodies against this bacteria in their blood. And antibodies against this bacteria are found in synovial fluid in the joints in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So an activation of the immune system against something in the mouth finds its way all the way into the joints. More generally, P. gingivalis increases inflammation, and it's one of those bacteria that, as I mentioned, can be swallowed, can withstand the acidity of the stomach, and also then influences the gut microbiome. So if you remember that a few weeks ago, we discussed how the gut microbiome is unbalanced in rheumatoid arthritis as well. Well, now we learn the oral microbiome is unbalanced in rheumatoid arthritis too. And if you remember, when we talked about this mechanism of how an unbalanced gut can affect the immune system, if you weren't there for this talk, this diagram, it looks a little bit like teeth. That's just coincidental. It's not. This is meant to be a diagram of the lining of the gut. So the things that look coincidentally a little bit like teeth are meant to be the epithelial cells that line the gut, and they should have tight junctions between them so that any toxins or unwelcome bacteria cannot get through into the bloodstream. When stimulated by various factors, including some pathogenic bacteria, these cells sort of move apart a little bit, and toxins and microorganisms from the gut can get through into the bloodstream, and then the immune system reacts to these. Now, this can happen in the gut as a result of what happens in the oral microbiome, but the same sort of thing can also happen when bacteria get into the bloodstream via the gums themselves. So we're getting microorganisms getting into the bloodstream. This alerts the immune system, and we get the type of immune cells responding that shift the immune system into an autoimmune type of response, more likely to attack the body's own tissues, including the joints. We also find that rheumatoid factor is found on and around the gums in those patients with rheumatoid arthritis who also have periodontal disease. So this is this two-way relationship where the body can't be subdivided really into rheumatology and dentistry. It's all linked. A flare-up of rheumatoid arthritis can prompt a flare in periodontal disease despite good oral hygiene. So if this has happened to you, you might think, well, I didn't change my diet and I didn't change my brushing, and you know, I haven't been having a load of sugar. What have I been doing wrong? It could be this relationship that your oral microbiome is being influenced by the RA disease activity. Mentioned that saliva provides nutrients to bugs in the mouth, and this is generally supportive of a healthy and diverse oral microbiome. So anything that dries the mouth out and impairs saliva flow is going to impact the oral microbiome. So steroids can do this, and steroid medication can further complicate things. And then if anybody has Sjögren's syndrome secondary to rheumatoid arthritis, this attacks the salivary glands and further dries the mouth. So we've already got a difficult situation where rheumatoid arthritis and periodontal disease affect each other, and then either complications or treatments can make matters worse. So generally, things that affect this balance in the mouth that we can have some control over, because we want to be able to influence it in a positive way to get this healthy, diverse oral microbiome. What can we do about it? Well, diet is one of the most obvious ones, and in the way that dentists will tell you that bacteria in the mouth will ferment sugar and form an acid as they do so as a byproduct, and this acid, when next to teeth, can cause decay, which is true, but it's slightly oversimplified, because if you just have some sugar or some simple carbohydrates in your diet, the balance of bacteria in your mouth should actually be able to cope with that. And if you have enough minerals and enough other good things in your diet, then you haven't reached a threshold where that sugar in the diet is going to be a problem. But as our diets have moved away from being balanced in the way that our grandparents' diets probably were, to being very high in sugar and also in simple carbohydrates, then we've simply overloaded the systems that are in place in our mouth to protect our teeth. So we've just got, we're encouraging too many of these bacteria that ferment the sugar and the fast carbohydrates, producing more acid than our body can buffer and deal with. So that can certainly lead to tooth decay, but just more generally, it's encouraged an overgrowth of those sugar fermenting, fast carbohydrate fermenting bacteria in the mouth. And that's a shift in the oral microbiome away from what we would have had, several hundred years ago. So it's a shift towards microbial imbalance as well as towards tooth decay. Poor oral hygiene and not physically removing the biofilms, the plaque and everything, the bacteria off your teeth, will obviously have an impact if there's already an imbalance there. Remember that our teeth don't clean themselves naturally, and we have to mechanically take away those biofilms. Anything, just as teeth don't shed, anything that you put into your mouth that's synthetic will also add another non-shedding surface. So braces, like orthodontic braces, dentures, plates, anything else that gets added into the mouth is an extra source for biofilm to cling onto, and makes getting rid of biofilms more difficult and can change the environment in the mouth. Antibiotics affect obviously our gut microbiome, but of course they will affect the balance of bacteria in our mouth as well, but sometimes they're unavoidable. Mouthwashes, however, most mouthwashes, even though they're purported to be good for our oral health, many of them contain alcohol, which will affect the oral microbiome and strip away good bacteria. So alcohol mouthwashes may not be good for oral health longer term. I mentioned that medications like steroids, and there are others, can also dry the mouth, and anything that dries the mouth affects your microbiome. Some of this is genetically based, and in the same way as we talked about early life factors influencing our gut microbiome, our oral microbiome is seeded during a normal birth and will be influenced by our mother's microbiome. So there's an element that we don't have control over in our life about what we've inherited, really. Smoking, of course, is one of the single biggest modifiable factors that can affect your microbiome, and also, of course, influence rheumatoid arthritis risk, possibly through some shared mechanisms, given that we know that periodontal disease and rheumatoid arthritis are so closely associated. So things that you could do, some of them obvious, some of them less so, to look after your oral microbiome and try and shift it into a healthy state. Whilst I'm talking as a nutritionist, talking about what you can do from a lifestyle point of view, of course, it's super important to visit your dentist and also to visit your hygienist regularly at the intervals recommended by your dentist and your hygienist, so that you can have your teeth cleaned regularly, have those biofilms removed professionally in areas that you can't maybe see yourself, and so that you can have early warning of anything more serious that's going on. And whatever I say today, you know, I don't want anyone to think that there's any substitute for regular dental care. And of course, brushing your teeth for 2 minutes twice a day, ideally well, including an electric toothbrush. Some dentists say, I've heard dentists tell me, sometimes you should use an electric and switch it up with a manual just so that you get into different areas, but ideally involving an electric toothbrush at some stage. But an additional thing here would be maybe using a toothpaste that does not contain SLS, SLS being sodium lauryl sulfate, which is included in toothpastes, not for any dental medical reason, but because it's a foaming agent and it makes your toothpaste froth up nicely. SLS can strip the mucosa, so that's the surfaces inside the mouth, surface of the cheeks, and therefore alter the oral microbiome, strip away good bacteria, and can also cause dry mouth or further exacerbate dry mouth. So finding a toothpaste that doesn't contain SLS can be helpful. I think some of the Allodent ones don't contain SLS. There are others, Biomin, I think. Yeah, as I say, I'm not a dentist and I don't want to get involved in recommending toothpaste for anyone because that's definitely outside my remit, but there are toothpastes that don't contain SLS. Flossing or using water picks or interdental brushes or something to get at those gaps between the teeth and the gums, as 30% of the oral bacteria live between our teeth. And then I mentioned that lots of mouthwashes contain alcohol. You can actually get probiotic mouthwashes as an alternative, which do not contain alcohol. And this is one that I would recommend, which is called Bio.me Oral. It's by a company called Invivo. It's a powder which you take a tiny scoop of and mix with water. And the main reason for taking a probiotic mouthwash is not because those bacteria will colonize the oral microbiome. They won't. But what the bacteria can do is they can help to break down biofilms, they can help to stop biofilms adhering, and they can influence the type of species that do live in the mouth. So it can have quite a big impact on oral health. The company that produces this has a functional dentist working for them who's steeped in all the research, and it's based on a lot of clinical evidence. So that's a good alcohol-free alternative mouthwash that's still taking very sensible steps to look after your mouth. When it comes to nutrition, as I mentioned, we all know that sugar, but also simple carbohydrates, encourage an overgrowth of what you might call bad bacteria. So bad bacteria in terms of our teeth are producing acid. If we overload that process, then we don't have enough minerals to buffer that acid, and we start leaching minerals away from our teeth, and that leads to decay. We do have, as I said, a tolerance. You can you don't have to you know, you're not going to get tooth decay just because you had one portion of simple carbohydrate. But a lot of the times in our Western diet, we overload that system and we're eating just too many carbs in general and simple carbohydrates and sugars in particular to maintain a healthy oral microbiome. Fibers, as well as healthy fats, have the opposite effect. So fibers, well, carbohydrates containing fibers won't be fermented at the same speed. So those encourage different bacteria in the mouth. Healthy fats are interesting. I did come across a research study that found that an intake of healthy fat was associated with a more diverse oral microbiome, but the researchers weren't quite sure why that was. There are other reasons for eating healthy fats that I'll come on to later, but we're not quite sure of the mechanism by which it affects the oral microbiome, perhaps only in the fact that if you have more fat in your diet, you might be having fewer carbs, so you may not be bathing your teeth in acid quite so much. Frequent snacking, we mentioned not being a good idea for the gut. It's also not great for the oral microbiome. So when we eat, the pH, that's how acidic or alkaline the saliva, the fluid in our mouth is. The pH goes down, more acidic when we're eating, and it should recover in between eating. That obviously doesn't happen just like that. It takes a bit of time to recover. If we're frequently grazing or snacking, then the pH in our mouth doesn't recover sufficiently between eating, and that on an ongoing basis will influence what bacteria can live and thrive in our mouths. From a nutritional point of view, to me, it seems intuitive that eating foods rich in polyphenols, these can feed bacteria. And so you would think that eating foods rich in polyphenols would encourage a diverse microbiome in the mouth, which is what we want. So these are foods like herbs and spices, berries, olives and olive oil, nuts. They're all high polyphenol content, even some dark chocolate or cacao powder without the sugar. You know, if you have that in things, that's a high polyphenol content food as well. And making sure, of course, that you stay well hydrated to, you know, just produce the raw materials for saliva production, so that the bacteria can be fed their nutrients and that the mouth doesn't dry out. It's not just nutrition that impacts the oral microbiome. There's also lifestyle impacts. The same sort of things that affect our gut microbiome. So sleep and stress have big impacts on all microbiomes in the body, really, and not in a good way if we have lack of sleep or high levels of stress. Intermittent fasting, the converse of frequent snacking, it can allow the microbiome to sort of reset itself. And again, those bacteria that like to munch on the sugar don't have so much of a chance to thrive. So that can help. Exercise also seems to have a resetting effect on multiple microbiomes in the body, including the mouth. Given that we said that anything that stops the flow of saliva and dries the mouth is bad for the oral microbiome, then a surprisingly big one is mouth breathing has a big effect. So if people have sinus congestion or a lot of mucus production or frequent colds or poor posture, sleep apnea, lots of things like this can affect our predisposition to, we should be breathing through the nose, especially, you know, including at night. If you're regularly waking up in the morning with a dry mouth, having realized that you've had your mouth open overnight, that could be a warning sign that maybe you're not breathing through your nose the way you think you might be. And mouth breathing, you know, you wake up with a dry mouth, it reduces saliva, it's going to have a big impact. If there's nothing serious going on, it's just a habit. I haven't researched this in detail, but I do know, I have heard people talking about mouth taping at night, where you just, you know, keep your mouth shut overnight to encourage you to breathe through the nose. Might not be that simple, because if you've got congestion, sinus issues, allergies, anything that's obstructing your airways, that can inhibit your ability to breathe through the nose. So it's worth getting those issues sorted out by the relevant health professional. If it's a postural issue, to have that looked at by perhaps a chiropractor, you know, whatever the issue is, to try and get it sorted so that you can keep breathing through your nose and allow your saliva to build up in your mouth the way it's meant to. And we mentioned smoking, which has a terrible effect on the microbiome. So that's what we can do for the oral microbiome. But then if you've already got periodontal disease or gum disease, what can you do for the health of your gums? Because remember, they're sort of like a gateway into the whole blood circulation, because bacteria can access the bloodstream right there in your gums. So nutrients and foods that can support the health of your gums. Collagen is generally a big nutrient for forming connective tissue in the body. So our tendons, our skin, all our connective tissue in the body, including our gums. So we can get collagen from animal bones. So it explains why that you might have come across big craze recently, I suppose, for things like bone broth, where you slow cook animal bones the same way just as traditional chicken soup or something like that was made. This extracts lots of gelatin and collagen from the bones, and that supports healing of connective tissue, including the gums. Vitamin C is really important for collagen as well. Vitamin C supports collagen strands, individual strands of collagen being linked together, being cross-linked, so that it forms a scaffold rather than just individual ropes connecting tissue. Fermented foods, of course, the probiotic bacteria in fermented foods generally help to maintain the health of those mucosal linings in the body. So the gut lining, fermented foods will help to keep tight junctions, but equally in the mouth, there's not much evidence, but we might think that the probiotic bacteria can help maintain mucosal barriers generally. Vitamin A and D are really interesting. They're fat-soluble vitamins. I first came across the relationship between vitamins A and D and oral health quite a few years ago, really, through a book that was written, believe it or not, back in the 1940s, I think, by an American dentist, based on research work he undertook just before the Second World War, where he traveled around. His name was Weston A. Price, and he traveled around lots of traditional societies in diverse remote parts of the world. So he went to remote villages in the Swiss Alps. He went to the Hebrides. He went to Pacific Islands. He traveled to remote tribes in Africa, and he looked at all their teeth. And he was an orthodontist. He was very interested in the development of healthy arches and avoiding, the orthodontic problems that he saw in clinics so much. And he found that wherever they were in the world, peoples who followed their traditional diets had very low incidence of orthodontic problems, whereas within a generation, when they switched to a Western diet that was high in white flour and seed oils and sugar, he documented this through photographs, then suddenly they had crowded teeth, they had missing teeth, they had poorly formed jaws. And he looked at the common factors between the diets, and he looked at what traditional peoples would eat if they thought there was likely to be a problem. And he came up with a theory that vitamin A and vitamin D were very important for the health of our teeth and for avoiding tooth decay, but also for forming our bones, including our jaw and our teeth. So these fat-soluble vitamins, they're interesting because not only do they help mineralize our teeth, so vitamin D helps us get calcium from the diet, vitamin A actually influences how the bone breaking down cells and the teeth breaking down cells, how they work. So they help mineralize teeth, but they also help maintain these mucosal barriers in the body, like the gums. So they're really interesting fat-soluble nutrients that I suspect many people are deficient in, that can help, if you have got periodontal disease, to have better integrity of the tissue in the mouth, so that bacteria can't get elsewhere in the body. And then the general anti-inflammatory diet that we've been talking about for the last 7 or 8 weeks, because if you have got systemic inflammation that's been activated somehow by periodontal disease, then you want to not add to that, and you want to actually take steps to reduce that. This is a more modern book than the 1940s dentist one I was talking about. This is only written, I think, 2 or 3 years ago by an Australian dentist called Dr. Stephen Lynn, who was a bit fed up of the limitations, I guess, he experienced in practice of not having very many tools at his disposal as a dentist to help his patients to have better oral health. And he started looking into all the lifestyle and nutrition links with oral health, and wrote this book called The Dental Diet, which, if you're interested in the subject, is is a really interesting read, actually, and he has come up with a suggested pyramid for a food pyramid for foods that will help your oral health. I mentioned the vitamins A and D and how important they are and how possibly people are lacking in them. Vitamin D, because we live in the Northern Hemisphere and we're not out working outside by and large all the time and exposing lots of our skin to the sun. And vitamin A, we may or may not be deficient in. We are meant to be able to, well, it's assumed that we can convert beta carotene from foods like carrots or sweet potatoes, squashes, those sort of yellow orange foods. It's assumed that we can convert that to vitamin A. But it's very dependent on your genetics, whether you can do that successfully or not. So not everyone will be able to successfully convert beta carotene to vitamin A. Most societies, that the earlier dentist I mentioned, Weston A. Price, went round, had animal products in their diet and you only get vitamin A and it's ready to use preformed state from animal products, but and you get especially high amounts of it in organ meat, which is something that's fallen a bit out of favor these days, but is a really high source of a lot of these fat soluble nutrients that are really actually important for oral health. So for my recipe today, I wanted to just leave you with my, well, I can hardly say it's my recipe, just how I cook liver and onions, which I think is just a fantastic superfood, liver. I know not everyone likes the thought of it, depending on whether you were force-fed it as a child or not, or maybe depending on your ethical beliefs. But I've included it here because it's such a high source of preformed vitamin A. I started eating it once a week a few years ago, and I've gone down to much less than that now, but I noticed a huge difference in my skin health. Vitamin A impacts the skin, the eyes, but also the teeth. So it's just really, a method of cooking liver and onions, and I happen to cook them in red wine. But liver you can regard as a superfood, actually containing nutrients which produce blood cells, which, as I say, support skin health, eye health, reproductive health, and also the health of our teeth. So vitamin A regulates the cells that are, our teeth are living structures, the cells that can break down those minerals and release them or include minerals in the teeth. So vitamin A being a really, really important nutrient for our mouth, and then also for the integrity of our gums. I don't forget vitamin C, of course, is really important for the collagen, and vitamin C deficiency can be observed firstly really by bleeding gums. It's an early sign of scurvy, actually, bleeding gums. So it's good to have your liver and onions with some green vegetables that will provide you with vitamin C as well. And there's a, low in simple carbs, high in fat soluble vitamins meal that's going to be good for your oral microbiome and your oral health generally in your teeth. But I just thought that was really interesting, actually, that there are other factors going on based on what you've inherited and what microbes you're predisposed to having in your mouth that may explain if you're having difficulties with periodontal disease, dental issues that are proving really difficult to deal with and clear up despite all your best efforts, that it's worth thinking that there can be other reasons behind that. And I'd be really interested to know if anybody has experienced that link between arthritis symptoms and the health of your mouth. It's certainly another aspect to consider that you may not have considered before in terms of your arthritis. So I'm going to stop there, but yeah, as I say, if you've got any experience about that to share, I would love to hear about them.
Yes, I have. I used to visit a periodontist in London for several years, and we're talking 20 years ago now, and he told me about the link between RA and periodontitis.
It's a long time ago. It's good.
Yeah.
And did you see the two flaring or becoming under control like in parallel with each other?
No, I never realized, I didn't sort of think about that. But I just know that he said that he found a lot of patients that he had that had periodontal disease also had RA. So that was how he formed the link. So I just thought, oh, it's the RA causing the periodontitis,
Yeah.
Or vice versa. Yeah, well, I suppose it was vice versa.
Sorry.
There when it all came about, yeah.
You've had some bad effects, haven't you? You've had some really bad effects during your RA.
I had laser treatment on my gums, which actually cleared it up. It was amazing because the pockets reduced dramatically. But there again, maybe the diet would be cheaper.
It possibly needs a multi-pronged approach. I'm not sure one thing on its own is enough. There is a new therapy apparently called guided biofilm therapy, which is not just your regular hygienist clean, but it's using a sugar alcohol called erythritol, which they put on the teeth, which is non-abrasive, and it breaks down the biofilms and you can remove much more. But I tried to look up where that was available, and I think it must only be privately at the moment. And it seemed to be, I tried to Google guided biofilm therapy near me, and nowhere near me came up. So I'm not sure it's very widely available yet. But as I say, I'm not a dentist, so I don't really know about
that. Could I make a comment?
Please.
So I worked as a consultant rheumatologist and I'm retired now, but we've never had any referrals from any dentist or dental surgeon or dental nurse for a patient suspected with rheumatoid arthritis, as opposed to the many referrals we've had from eye doctors who had patients with episcleritis, scleritis, or iritis, or uveitis, who had rheumatological conditions, which were ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis. So either the dentists don't know about this, rheumatologists, and there is a lot of periodontitis there that they're not advising the patient or asking the patients if they got joint symptoms and referring on, or they're not conveying a message to the GPs to ask them to refer these patients. The other one was that, of course, in the synovial fluid, we find all sorts of antibodies to all sorts of bacteria, but some of them are just particles, and you don't find the full antibody. And whether that is causative or not is something that nobody is certain about. And the next thing I want to ask you was about your opinion about, I've had this recent thought process about a very tiny film of olive oil rings of the mouth, extra virgin olive oil rings of the mouth. And in my thinking, I have not told this to anyone, I'm just asking you for your opinion, whether this might be protective, especially in us senior citizens who are more prone to get dry mouths.
I've not come across research on the extra virgin olive oil. Is it similar to like the type of oil pulling that would be done in Ayurveda with sesame oil or coconut oil? Because there is some research that at the very least that doesn't cause harm, and that may, there are one or two studies here and there that show benefit in terms of reducing gum disease. Yeah, I hadn't come across it with the extra virgin olive oil, but I wouldn't expect it to be, expect it to be similar. Yeah.
I've come across it through my Sjogren's consultant at Guy's. She's recommended the oil.
Thank you.
Interesting.
But I have noticed a flare up. I've had a flare up recently in my system, and it started with my eyes, and then I had sore gums, and then the rest of the system kicked in. So there's definitely a link.
Yeah.
But it's, the problem is you can end up under 10 different consultants, and they're all looking at different parts of your body, reassuring you there's nothing nasty going on, but you're living inside this body with every different system kicking off, and you're left to live with it, which is the frustrating thing.
I mean, I can't answer the question about whether dentists don't refer because patients don't talk to them about their other symptoms or because they're not aware of the links. I have tried to talk to every dentist I've come in contact with over the past few years, with myself or with my children, including orthodontists at the Royal London who I see with my son, talking to them about the work of Weston A. Price, the work of Stephen Lynn, how diet influences dentistry, and I've always just been met with a rather blank stare at best. So I'm just not sure that it's included in training. There are some functional dentists who are very aware. The lady I mentioned who works for Invivo, who make the probiotic mouthwash, is co-authoring several papers on the links between periodontal disease and various other disease conditions at the moment. But, you know, I can't speak to, you know, the interest amongst other dentists, but it is something that we can influence through diet and lifestyle. So that's sort of where the crossover comes.
It was my dentist who made the link.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he was keen to refer me, even though to discharge me, he sent me back again. So
yeah. So
now moving on it.
So can I be excused for asking another question?
Yeah.
So have you had any thoughts about a gluten-free diet and its effect on the oral microbe?
Well, gluten, I suppose, in the way that it's normally consumed, being through flour products, is quite ground down and would fit in with that class of quite fast carbohydrates that bacteria would ferment to producing acid. So yeah, most, maybe not pasta so much as bread, but certainly most bread products would be likely to shift the balance to those bad bacteria that would encourage decay. So simply by virtue of removing a source of quite high glycemic index carbohydrate, then a gluten-free diet might help. I'm not sure what the mechanism would be other than that. So gluten can aggravate the tight junction process through zonulin release in the gut, but I'm not aware of anything similar that happens in the mouth. So more based on its simple carbohydrates.
Yeah, thank you.